do today is try to take you through the whole project in miniature of what we've tried to do for the last 3 years in terms of bringing together the elections community and the accessibility community to look at the issues related to accessible voting. You're going to see some things, I think, in this that will at least add to your body of knowledge of how we best serve those with accessible needs. First off, the Election Assistance Commission, through a congressional mandate, is the one who did indeed, I think, as Ernie mentioned this, funded 2 groups to look at this issue, and we were one of the 2 groups having a slightly larger amount of money to work with on the project. And so we have looked at a number of things, but this 3-year study now is concluding, and in fact our report to the EAC I think is due sometime this summer, and I don't know when the EAC will actually make that available, but at least our report is due to them at a little later date than we originally had. Here are the objectives that we were looking at in terms of trying to see the issues related to this whole subject matter. Certainly, as the disabilities that were defined by the ADA, we wanted to look at those and to figure out how do we make voting more accessible. We wanted to look at those who have had lack of educational opportunity, and so this is both from an education standpoint and a cognitive standpoint, some things that we're going to look at. Difficulties due to aging, and let me say to you, once we get to that section today, this is going to be one that is a growing problem and is going to be more massive than I think most of us have thought through in recent times, and so it will begin to change the way we have to administer elections for a good number of years now. We wanted to look also at limited English proficiency and how do we make voting accessible for those who have limited English proficiency, and how do we work best with this. Here are the partners. RAAV, Research Alliance for Accessible Voting, is what RAAV stands for. Clemson University was the project manager. Dr. Juan Gilbert and his crew at Clemson have been directing the project. The Center for Accessible Information, the Association of Assistive Technology Act Programs, Paraquad, Tennessee Disability Coalition, the Election Center that we represent, Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, Election Data Services from Kim in the back, and Carnegie Mellon University out in Silicon Valley. What I hope we do today, if nothing else, is for all of us to understand that we sort of need to view this problem differently. And part of this is that we have been able, over a period of time, to say, well, there's a limited number of folks who have accessible voting needs, and because of that, the cost-benefit factor of providing services to that has not been sufficient for us to spend lots of money on the election side. Let me turn that around on you. If we were to look at this as instead that it is a person's right to participate in democracy, and we need to do what is necessary to allow them to participate, and to try to remove the barriers so that they can exercise their rights, then we see it in a little different light. Now, most of us have gotten to the point in life now that we have either friends or relatives who have some kind of accessible needs. And so if you start asking yourself, would I want my son or my daughter or my mother or my father to be limited because somebody said, well, there's not enough money to take care of you, there's not enough money to make voting available to you, that would not be the right answer, would it? And so this is what we want to do, is for everyone to kind of take a step back and say, okay. Now, again, part of this has been because the standard numbers in terms of percentage of Americans that have accessible needs has varied, and we'll look at some numbers here in a little while, has varied on that. We've said to ourselves, well, that percentage means that we may not do as much as we ought to do. I'm going to show you in a little while some numbers that say that percentage is going to grow at a geometric progression to the extent that we're likely to have such a sizable part of the population with accessible needs that we're going to have to rethink how we do most of this. Certainly, we wanted to look at ideas that can have sort of an immediate impact on elections. And you'll get to hear from Dr. Gilbert's group, particularly from Clemson, in terms of we were looking at ways to suggest to vendors how we could change processes, what kind of new processes we could develop, what kinds of ways we could approach some of these same standard issues and maybe develop a new answer or two or three. Certainly, as you look at what Paraquat has done, what Tennessee Disability Coalition has done, what assistive technology groups have done, you're going to begin to see a pattern here of attempts to make this better and what we've learned. And some of it was surprising to us. Some of it was continuation of knowing that we've still got problems and how to fix those problems. And we wanted to say, how can we get to the point of impacting elections in the future to make all of this better? Well, looking at the studies that are out there, somewhere between 36 million and 54 million people, depending on whose data you use, have accessible needs. If you take the standard Census Bureau response to that, roughly 75% of the population is a voting age population, and so roughly 75% of those would be of voting age in those. And so, as you can see, the numbers came from both the Census Bureau, the American Community Survey, and the Survey of Income and Program Participation that the states do. Tidal wave is coming. Look, I'm of that baby boomer generation. I'm almost old enough now to be a poll worker. I've gotten, And so this group that was born in 1946, and I'm one of them, that runs from 46 to 64 by Census Bureau definition, is the tidal wave of voters that are coming through the process that we are now beginning to see because they live longer. They are the best group of voters that we've got. Consistently throughout the history of voting, if you look at it, it's the older voters that participate more, that participate in higher percentages. They are the ones who actually come out and turn out for elections. And so what we're looking at is this number between the voting age population of 45 and older in 1998 was 80 million. Look at that. It jumped to 120 million just 14 years later. That is a 50% increase in terms of this age group, okay? So what we're looking at, add to it that those folks are living longer. They are living longer on average now, 15 to 25 years longer than previous generations. Modern era of drugs and hip replacements and knee replacements and heart valves and right on down the line. And now we've got a situation where, because they not only are coming into the retirement age and or just the longer age, we're likely to be stuck with this problem, not problem, I don't want to call it that, but this trend for the next 35 years. Well, that's a huge impact in terms of elections. I noticed particularly, personally, when I went to early voting last year, not last year, 2 years ago. I went to early voting, and I happened to go to an early voting site that was just very popular, and so I ended up having to wait almost an hour in line. And I'm getting to the point that I've had hip problems, and I'm probably a candidate now for hip replacement at some point. And I noticed standing in line how difficult that was for me over that period of time. And I thought, gee, a chair would be nice. And so I asked about the chair situation, and elections officials in several parts of the country, when I asked this question, said, we don't want chairs in the polling place. We don't want people hanging around. Well, we may have to change our attitude, because this is one of those situations where we're going to have to do something for people who can't stand for long periods of time. Hopefully we'll get to the point that we don't have lines ever again as a result of all the presidential study that's come along about long lines. But assuming that we don't fix that problem just instantly, we're going to have to rethink how we do some of this. And so as this group ages, eyesight begins to change. I notice I have to get a whole lot closer to things now. Whether it's a television screen or whether it's a newspaper or a book or what have you, those are things. Hearing. Now, my wife says I have honeydew hearing. It just tunes her out. Truth is I notice I have to turn the television up louder, And so hearing issues are there. Certainly standing for a lot of folks is a very, very difficult situation now. You will notice that we have more and more of our voters either in wheelchairs or on canes or on walkers. And so this is a change that's coming, and it's coming in such significant numbers. One of the elections officials asked me, what did I think that they could get rid of curbside voting? I said, because they thought it was expensive, and I said, I not only think you can't get rid of it, I think you're going to end up doing more of it. Because this is one of those situations where we are just looking at demographics that tell us this is going to be a big, big change. So what you need to do, obviously, is look at your communities and see what's happening with you. But clearly, I would say to you, begin to plan that this is not going to be a problem that is this size. It's going to be a problem that's this size. And so that we need to look at how we're going to do this. The survey data that you're going to look at in that was done by Lisa Schur, Mara Ada, and Doug Cruz at Rutgers University. The survey data was people with disabilities. Finding out, well, first off, let me tell you that we oversampled in that. Where is that? I don't guess I have it here. We oversampled in this. We did a survey nationwide of, there it is, 3,022 voters nationwide in 2012 after the election. We surveyed 2,000 people with disabilities so that we would have a large enough sample size to draw conclusions about what those with disabilities need. And then we sampled 1,022 people who did not have disabilities who were also voters. All of them were qualified as voters first so that we knew that they had actually participated and knew what the process was doing so that we could then draw conclusions for all of you. Voters with disabilities ended up those who voted either early or by mail. Early or by mail. Any disability voted early in the polling place or in the elections office, 42%. Voted by mail, 28.1% of the respondents that were asked the question, okay? And then they break them down by each of the disability groups, and so you can look at that, and I'm not going to go over all of that, but the data is provided to you so that when you get home, you can really go through the data and begin to analyze who your voters are and what they're very likely to be in terms of each of these also, okay? What we discovered was that 2.3% fewer registrations to vote than voters with no disabilities. And it doesn't sound like much, but think about 2.3% of 135 million folks. Actually, a registration, it's 177 million folks. And so 2.3% now begins to be a fairly significant number of people. 5.4% actually vote less than voters with no disabilities, okay? Among those who actually registered to vote. Notice here, registered to vote, disability, 69.2%. Okay? This is, and if they had no disability, 71.5% of them actually registered to vote. Voted if registered, 82% versus 87.5% for the general public. Again, those numbers begin to be fairly significant when you start multiplying out by the hundreds of millions. And so, voters with accessible needs, 5 times more likely to have some issue related to health or family illness as a reason for not voting. Now, why is that significant? Well, on election day, if you personally have a severe disability and you're having a really bad day, then it means you can't get there, right? You cannot do it. Or if you've got a family member that you're having to take care of that has some form of disability. Or if you're a disabled person and has a family member who's not disabled and you're still having to care for them, this is also an issue. And so when you look at this, that 5 times more likely means that we must find ways in some cases to overcome some of that. And so we have to rethink a little bit about how do we make voting accessible and available for folks who may end up having a different kind of deal. Voters with no disabilities were 8.2%, and with some disability, look at here, 43% were more likely to have a problem, okay? This is a number that it seems to me is one that we need to look at and we need to think about, because we have made considerable strides in the elections business to make polling places far more accessible than they used to be, and yet we are still discovering that our polling places, for whatever reason, still have a fairly significant number of people who have difficulties using the actual polling place that we have selected. Now, part of this has been, I think, in some cases, as we have shifted from schools, many of you have had to get out of schools, and we've gone to churches or other facilities that may not be set up quite as well as schools to be able to use. And so this does have some impact on us, and we're having to look at how do we change this. Notice that only 8% of voters without disabilities reported any polling place problems or concerns. It means do not assume that your polling place is as accessible as you think it is. Go back and re-look and rethink. Be sure you check everything again to... One of the simplest things that seems to go wrong more often than not is we have correct signage in the parking lot. We have correct signage at the entryway that most folks will use. But if we send a group of people off on a path in order to get an accessible ramp or a wider doorway, all of a sudden, signage stops. They get around there and then don't know where to go afterwards. And so these are things that we need to think through. You've got to have signage all along the path in order to do this. Otherwise, folks don't know how to get there and what to do, okay? How did you vote? Those with disabilities, 49% still vote on paper, and this is, I think, largely due that number stays this high, largely due to the number of states that have moved to vote by mail. Those are fairly sizable states. You're looking at Colorado, California, Washington, Oregon, and there's one other in there that is that's talked about moving significantly to vote by mail. And so when you look at that, those then become the standard answer for them is to have everything done by mail. We just had a study done by a university that really, the professor and the university, I think, were in favor of vote by mail, and so they were explaining just how wonderful vote by mail is. Well, paper for those with severe disabilities causes a huge problem, folks. I mean, if you assume that paper is good because they can do it at home and they can have anybody help them they want to have help them, and therefore they can exercise their right, it is still not private and independent. That's one of the problems. Now, Help America Vote Act, when it was passed, said we were going, the standard to follow was that it could be done independently and it could be done privately. That's what the Help America Vote Act requires. And so when you're looking at paper as your answer, then you need to figure out, does it truly comply with making sure that the voters can do it privately and independently? And so don't get into self-delusion that because you've gotten to the point that the answer politically in your state or in your jurisdiction is that you must use paper, then you've got to also figure out, how do I make sure that those with disabilities voters with disabilities, can indeed vote privately and independently, and that sometimes may not mean paper, okay? And so this is what you need to look at. Those with disabilities vote on touchscreen, 37%. Notice that that's a higher number than those without disabilities. And 5% is a fairly significant number when you start looking at those in terms of the 137 million voters. That gets to be a pretty big number. Punch button. And so these are numbers to pay attention to and considerations for you all to look at. Voters with some disability. Notice the differences there. Notice the differences in the numbers. 36% of those voting on paper had some difficulty versus 2.6% of those without disabilities. Folks, that's a huge increase. Huge increase. And so if you and your staff are looking at this and saying, well, you know, most voters report to us they're not having any problems with that, then realize that we're not talking about most voters, okay? That number is, about 15 times higher? And so it's one of those where we need to look at. 23% had some difficulty with punch button versus 0.3% if you had no disability. 20% had difficulties with touchscreen versus 6.4% with no disability. So even here, it's 3 times higher. And we know right now that the touchscreen, or we've used touchscreen, I think, sometimes in survey work to really mean any form of electronic voting. But if we look at that, it is, electronic voting actually allows more types of disabilities to participate. And so it is one that we need to be aware of and have some concern for. One of the nice things about what the survey did for all of us in terms of elections, because I can tell you, when we first started the big initial push on working on these issues in 1996, I think it came after Lightbourne versus El Paso County, Texas, in terms of having to make issues related to accessible voting come to the fore and get a little bigger. When we looked at this, we were discovering that elections folks were not very well thought of in terms of their attitudes and the way they handled people with disabilities and or made the process accessible. In fact, we had lots of anecdotal stories going along telling us that folks were told, well, you know, if you're in a wheelchair, we just didn't design those booths for you in the wheelchair, and so maybe the best thing for you to do is to vote from home or vote by mail or what have you. And so we've come a long way since then. And so some of the data that you're going to see is really interesting data, and I think it tells a success story, but it probably also shows us that we've got some things left to do. Ease of voting. Those with disabilities said it was easy. 76% said it was very easy. Some said the 17.6% somewhat easy, for a total of 93.6%. With no disabilities, here's the number, okay? Those that had difficulties, 5.8% versus 1.7%. So roughly 3.5 times. If you're disabled, you have more difficulty voting than general populace, but this number has dropped significantly in this last 18, 20 years, okay? And so we have seen a really major improvement in this. Voters with disabilities, they need assistance almost in a 3-to-1 ratio. This is what the survey shows us in terms of those numbers. Add to it the problem of the growing aging population, and we're going to begin to see even bigger numbers. Equipment was set up and ready for use. This was the #1 complaint for a very long time, that the equipment was not set up and not ready for use when a person with disabilities got to the polls. Because what happened in too many jurisdictions was people were waiting on the first voter with disabilities to show up before they actually opened up the equipment and made it available. One of the things we've tried to say to everybody is don't do that. Set it up in the morning, have it ready, have it available. Truthfully, there probably ought to be more people than just those with disabilities voting on that equipment too, so that we cannot actually pinpoint how voters with disabilities vote. So we ought to be encouraging more of them. But look, the converse of this is, however, that means 25% weren't. If you take 25% of our locations in America still not having the equipment set up, now we're starting to talk about a pretty high number around the country. And so this is one of the things we want to look at. The election official knew how to set it up and make it work. Now, from the disabled, this is from the disability groups themselves, they're saying 97% of them said yes. The election official knew what they were doing, knew how to set it up. That means poll workers are doing their jobs, right? Treatment by elections officials. I found this to be really, really interesting. The disability groups, those voters with disabilities, said elections officials 95% of the time were respectful. Versus the public doesn't think so. You know, the other folks, those without disabilities, think we respond in a lower number here. Very disrespectful, 1.7%. That number is down so dramatically over this last 18, 20 years, that is incredible to me. So something has been going on in terms of the way you all are approaching your jobs and being able to help out here. How helpful were elections officials if they needed help? Again, those with disabilities thought the elections officials were far more helpful than those without disabilities, okay? Not helpful at all. 8% of those without disabilities thought we weren't very helpful, and yet only 1.7% of those with disabilities thought that. Pretty interesting numbers, aren't they? And so, again, all of this data is in that stuff that you have there by you. All right, voting equipment should be set up and ready for use for any voter. Clearly, we need to know that. We've talked a little bit about the signage. You can look at tables 9 and 11 about seeing the ballot, which are good tables for you to pay attention to. Which is correct? Voting is an individual right of U.S. citizens, or voting is only available if we can afford it. See, and when you look at that and when you answer that question, I think the answer becomes obvious for all of us in terms of what we want to do here. What concerns do you have or hopes? And again, all of the tables data is there for you to be able to go through as you get back home with your crews, and for you all to sit down and look at all those tables. You'll begin to discover a wealth of information here that you can apply in your own jurisdiction. And so that's the reason we gave you all the tables and all the data.
Going along with your records, and thank you so much, Doug, because they're very encouraging. In the city of Richmond, with approximately 130,000 voters, our curbside voting increased from 2008 presidential to 2012 presidential 36%. And Norman Shelton and I both do instruction as well as the machine maintenance and programming and so forth. But telling our election officials, get used to it, don't complain. It's going to get larger and larger because people are living longer. Thank you for affirming that.
Good. So your numbers almost doubled.
Yep.
Almost doubled in one election cycle.
Yep.
And
now, this is between presidentials.
Right, between presidentials, exactly. And I think that number, again, I mean, what clearly the data indicates is that number is going to be on a continuing upscale.
Absolutely, because people are definitely living longer, and you know, our election officials are being trained because we have a precise way of taking our curbside machines to the voter, and you know, there's legal processes that we have to go through with that. And we've had to train more election officials on that and making them comfortable and courteous to our voters concerning that. In 2008, I actually had to go into some of the precincts because we had busloads of disabilities coming in. And there was one chief outside, because in the state of Virginia, you have to have 2 election officials with each machine, but the chief can go by herself, and she was trying to go outside and address all of these by herself. But at any rate, yes, your tables are consistent with ours.
I think one of the other things that we're going to need to look at is we've been posting ballots on the wall, the sample ballot on the wall for people to look at. But how do they get out of line to see that? You know, and where do they reinsert themselves into the line when they do that? Seems to me one of the things we probably ought to be doing. Now, I know a lot of you have got, you know, where you run multiple precincts and all of that, but run a sample ballot that gets down to a certain level and at least takes care of handing it out in line so that they can have it. So that when they get ready to vote, they know most of the ballot.
Yeah, our curbside officers take out the sample ballots, as well as our courtesy officers who check in the voters when we have lines.
Perfect, yes.
In your presentation, you mentioned a lot about paper ballot and how sometimes it can be one of the difficulties that people with disabilities have. I know for my state, we do not have pictures and diagrams in our ballot. If we were to add that to the paper ballot, do you think it would help enhance at least some more people coming out to vote?
The problem with paper is not just the, I'm assuming you're talking about adding pictures and graphs and the readability, the legibility, and granted, most ballots are in far too high a reading level, and I know you're stuck with all kinds of statutory limitations on what you can do with referendum language, et cetera. But there have been a few studies that suggest that, yeah, you know, pictures might be helpful, but you run into all sorts of dilemmas and political questions about pictures and how do I look? I mean, you know, and it's a legitimate concern from the people who are running kind of thing. However, the much bigger problem with paper ballots is not the legibility of the content. It's the fact that it is print on paper, which is completely and totally inaccessible to somebody with vision limitations and or somebody with significant motor dexterity limitations. And I've said it, anybody that's been around me, I mean, we have been fighting the inaccessibility of paper since Gutenberg invented the press. If we had a simple solution for making print on a piece of paper accessible, we would have done it centuries ago. We don't. We have lots of solutions, but they're not cheap, they're not easy, and they're hard to build into a voting machine, quite frankly. So, you know, sadly, when the vision of HAVA and everybody voting on electronic machines went out the door with the security concerns and the people insisting on paper ballots, accessibility just got trampled on. And there's just no other way of saying it. So I think the biggest message is for those of you who didn't really realize that paper is inaccessible, period. This is not an accessible media. So if that's how you're voting, and that's the only mechanism you have to vote, like the mail-in states do, then you have major access problems, period. There's just no two ways about it. I mean, it's not a pleasant message, but I think it's an accurate one. And honestly, one that I don't think a lot of election officials understand. I think they think mail-in voting is so convenient that it just works for everybody. It does not. I mean, you can't vote privately and independently on paper if you have vision or motor disabilities, typically. So,
additionally, I think one of the things that we're going to need to consider in this is not just the act of voting, but it's voter information. Voter information on most of our websites is written at a high school or a college level. We need to be bringing this information down. Now, I will tell you, I think the groups on literacy used to suggest sixth grade level. I think they're dropping that now to about the fourth grade. And so you need to look at the information that you have. And I honestly will tell you that I think before this is over with, those of you who do not have your information in a readily accessible format for blind, reading difficulties, cognitive difficulties, are going to find yourselves under lawsuits. And so this is one of those where you really need to look at the whole aspect. Website, information that's printed and handed out, information that's mailed out. If you're one of those that is forced to send out voter pamphlets and voter information, then you probably need to rethink and redo as to how that can be made easily accessible and understandable. Clearly, we don't have control over state legislatures and what they put on a ballot. And it would be nice if ballot language really indicated that yes means yes and no means no, instead of yes means no and no means yes. I mean, clearly legislatures love to pull these routines. In Florida, the last time, you know, part of the reason some of the lines got long in Florida is that the legislature put on so many constitutional amendments, one of which was 750 words in length. And so, my goodness, you know, those of us that have got a pretty high reading level skill even have difficulty with those. And so, this is part of the things that we need to look at. So, what we're trying to say to you is, look at every piece of accessibility related to voting as a process. And that includes the early information of how to get registered and how to vote and how to find a place and how to get served and right down the line and making it in accessible formats. Okay? Are there other questions?
One of the questions, I know that the Presidential Commission's report had talked about and had recommended unanimously the expansion of voting opportunities, whether that came in the form of early voting, whether that came in the form of allowing more people to be able to vote by mail. What kind of impact, and would it be a positive one? How much could that help potentially dealing with this issue? It wouldn't be a complete panacea, but I'm sort of curious as to whether or not expanded opportunities for voting would go a substantial way to trying to mitigate some of the difficulties that we either are having now or that we see on the horizon.
If you're a voter with disabilities, and on the day that Election Day is held, you then either have transportation problems or you're having health issues or what have you, and you've only got one shot at this, then you miss that shot. Whereas if you expand that opportunity in terms of some form of early voting, where there are multiple opportunities to exercise your right, then you cut down on the missed opportunities is what you do. And so from the standpoint, I think, of particularly voters with disabilities, the opportunity to have more shots at doing this is better. Clearly it's better. You can arrange for transportation finally, you can, and or if you've got health issues personally or health issues family-wise, you can choose another opportunity. And so I think clearly this weighs in the favor of making voting more accessible.
Cameron Quinn, Fairfax County. I have two questions that really have to do with motivating human behavior. One, how do you get the curbside voters to only be those who need it? Because under federal law, anyone over the age of 65 can choose to do so. And we know that there's going to be additional pushes to encourage people to do so, which means that some of the people that are eligible but not necessarily needing it are going to take advantage of it. And it creates a lot of challenges. And two, how do you motivate your election officers who know how to set up the touchscreen equipment to make sure they do so in the morning when you've got so many polling places you can't easily check up on them?
I think it is too difficult to have poll workers and or even poll supervisors try to discern whether or not you truly need some form of assistance. So that we're going to have to leave that to the voter. If the voter says the voter needs it, we're going to have to assume that the voter needs it. Part of it is because some disabilities are not readily apparent.
Absolutely, but we know from reports we're getting that in some cases that's not the case. What can we be doing to encourage those voters who don't need it to try and be more reasonable?
You know, and it's a good question that I don't have an answer for. I will say to you, At this point, I think we're just going to have to live with the fact that it's probably going to cost us more and it's going to grow faster and all of that. We're just going to have to do that. Because the converse of that is to say that then we have to become value judges as to whether or not you truly need this and can use this and whether or not it's eligible to you. And at that point, I think we end up in a lot of court cases. And so that's probably going to be one of those that we just end up having to eat some of this. In terms of, what was your second question again? And the second part was? Oh, how do we get elections officials to actually do their job, basically, to set up the equipment early in the morning? You know, I don't know. Some of you who have done this, some of you who have been able to get your folks to do this, have you got suggestions for, yes, Judy?
Required in law.
Required in law?
That all machines have to be up and ready by 6 a.m. And anybody in the polling place can call and turn in,
Okay,
and it's a fine.
all right. Yes, ma'am?
We watch them in training, and the ones that look like they've got any type of difficulty, we send our machine techs out to be there when they open.
Okay, good. Because we still get reports from some parts of the country where they don't really like electronic voting and therefore they don't want to set up the equipment, that we're getting reports that it's just not set up until actually somebody needs it, and then they have to stand and wait for 20 minutes while it's, you know, booted up and running and what have you. Cameron, I don't know the answer other than I think you've heard a couple of pretty good suggestions here, and so there we have it.